Thank you, Alistair. I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the secret world of game narrative, and I apologise in advance. I only have two speaking modes. I have intensely smouldering, which takes too long for a 30-minute session, or pants-burningly manic, which is where I'm going to go for today. So, it's going to be a little bit on the manic side. And I should like to start with a game that is an acknowledged masterpiece of game narrative. I'm speaking, of course, of Pac-Man. Now, Pac-Man, in case you don't know, is significant for a number of reasons. This wonderful little 1980 arcade coin-op, designed by Toru Iwatani, is actually the very first cutscenes in video games. After you clear a few levels, which you had to be reasonably good at Pac-Man to clear a few levels, it's not that easy, you would get a little skit. So here's an example of one where Blinky chases Pac-Man off to the left, and then Pac-Man grows giant size and chases Blinky back off. These are not particularly ambitious pieces of narrative, but what makes Pac-Man a really interesting example for game narrative is its procedural elements, specifically the design of these four ghosts. In English, we call them Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde. But you'll notice on the attract screens for the game, they not only have their nickname, but a description of their character. But unfortunately, the English translations mess this up, so we're going to have to switch to Japanese. So turn on your universal translators, and there we go. So I will go through them one at a time, and you'll see how this works. Akabe is Red Guy, okay? Red Guy's character is Oikake, okay? Oikake, the chaser. So Blinky, as we call him in English, pursues Pac-Man directly. He is always up Pac-Man's arse, chasing him round the map, right? And then Pinky is Machibuse, the ambusher. Pinky, being the smartest of the four ghosts, aims 16 pixels ahead of Pac-Man to head him off and trap him with Blinky behind. Very clever. Iosuke, the blue guy, has the character Kimagure, meaning roughly whimsical, and has oddly dynamic behaviour. You can see the picture here. The place that Pinky, I can't even remember what the English version is. Iosuke, the place that Iosuke aims for is determined both by Pac-Man's position and by Blinky's position. So it's a little bit harder to work out exactly what he's going to do. And lastly, Guzuta, slow guy, has the character Ottoboke. Feigning ignorance is the best translation I can offer you. And what he does is, if he is more than 64 pixels away from Pac-Man, then he does what Blinky does. He chases directly towards Pac-Man. But if he gets within 64 pixels, he bizarrely enters scatter mode, which is what the ghosts do when Pac-Man has a power pill and everyone runs for the hills. So he keeps the pressure on Pac-Man but never gets too close, which is really awkward. If you're an experienced player of the game, it means that he is almost always where you want to be when you're trying to escape from Blinky and Pinky, who are right there on top of you. So you can see here, right back in 1980, what you might call an essential split in the way that games go about their narrative content. On the one hand, we have traditional narrative elements, right? Little comedy skits in cutscenes in between the gameplay. And on the other hand, we have what we might call game narrative or game systems narrative, using procedural elements to create story experiences for the player. Right, in case you don't know who I am, Alistair did give me a nice introduction. I hit 50 published games this year, which I'm very smug about. Thank you. My 50th game was Shadows Awakening, which was a sequel to, if you excuse the pun, my cult hit. It wasn't really a hit, but it was a cult. Cult Heretic Kingdoms. We had, I think, 12 attempts at a sequel to that game before finally shipping one this year. And I'm working on 9 titles at the moment, but the only one I can discuss at the moment is Tropico 6, which will be out early next year. I also do quite a bit of writing. I got into philosophy. I picked up a very bad philosophy habit, if I may quote Discworld Noir. So I did a trilogy of philosophy books for Zero on the role of imagination in various aspects of human life. And they turned out to be such gargantuan tomes that nobody could read the lot of them without melting. So I started working on shorter philosophy books. In 2016, I thought it'd be fun to play with the concept of knowledge under the title Wikipedia Knows Nothing. The Wikipedia editors were less amused and deleted me from the Wikipedia a week after I announced the title of the book. This year, I have a new short-form book out. It's called The Virtuous Cyborg. It is about the relationship between our behavior and the technologies that we use. And there's a ton of game stuff in there. There are brilliant examples of how games positively and negatively affect people's behavior. And my publisher, who is very poor, would very much like it if you bought some of the copies I brought with me after my talk. So if you're looking for a way to suck up to me, that is a surefire win for me and my publisher. Now, question, is narrative just wrapping paper? Well, at a narrative conference, I assume there won't be many people to take this view, although there are loads of people out in the world and out in game studies who think that narrative is just what you put around the outside of a game, right? So the idea is you peel off all of the story materials, all of the fictional world, and it's the crunchy game systems underneath. They're the real game, right? So as an example to illustrate this idea, this is my friend Dan Cook's Tripletown. It was ripped off by another company to make Yeti Town. Both of the games have identical game systems under the hood, right? The game systems work in exactly the same ways, which is why Spryfox sued the makers of Yeti Town for completely ripping them off. And so the argument, the intuition, if you will, that gets kicked up by these kind of situations is that the real game is the system under the hood, right? Because Yeti Town only just messes around with a little bit of fiction on the surface. Now, the trouble with this is, if we look further afield, it starts to look less like that's a plausible account of things. So, let's take, for instance, Star Wars. Let's take the real Star Wars movies, not the big-budget Disney fan fiction. I'm sure they're great. But the original Star Wars trilogy is built on Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, which was never really intended as prescriptive, but George Lucas understood what Campbell was doing and used it to inspire the Star Wars movies. And so the whole of the original trilogy is explicable as an expression of this system, the hero's journey, right? So stories are also systems under the hood, right? You don't always use the hero's journey, and there are other systems for understanding the way stories fit together. But in terms of the question, is narrative just wrapping paper? The real problem with this is no, because games and stories are both systems, and what you want to do if you want to do good narrative design is align the game systems and the story systems so that they work together, right? So although we can discard the sort of story elements, the fictional elements, and get to just the crunchy game design, we can equally discard the game elements and keep the narrative systems. Both options are always live for us. Now, in terms of Pac-Man, the interesting thing about this, for me, is the way the procedural elements create the story for this game, right? The game design and the story design align in this sense. Not that the cutscenes support it, they're really just little throwaway rewards to give you a chance to relax. But the procedural elements create what I think is the finest chase scene in any medium you would like to pick. No Hollywood chase scene gives you such insight into the characters involved in driving around a city in a car as playing a game of Pac-Man. I think it's a fantastic example of the form. Now, my company, International Hobo, we're mercenaries and we go and take money from anyone who will pay us, is the honest truth. But one of the things we do is we analyze the way people play video games. We try and understand how and why people like the games that they do. Our latest model is this one, the 10-player motives, but I don't have time to go through all of the motives, so I'm just going to focus on 3 that are relevant for this conference, because we're interested here in adventure games, and these 3 motives are the main ones we want. The narrative motive, to engage with characters and events that build to a climax. The agency motive, to assert the player's capacity to have an effect within the world of the game. And the puzzle solving or problem solving motive, to work out how to solve confusing puzzles through patient application. Every adventure game that you love hits at least one and probably more than one of these motives, maybe all 3, right? This is the space that we're working in. When writers come from other media, when they come from film, for instance, which is mostly where our imported writers are taken in from, they understand the narrative motive very, very well indeed, much better than most people working in games do. So that's a plus. But unfortunately, they don't really understand the agency motive at all. So their first thought in how to do video game stories is to give the players choices. Except they're not really giving the players choices, because what they're doing is defining the choices that the players will make. They are still in charge of everything. this sleight of hand is sort of standard in video games and we're used to it. But to really get the most out of agency, you need to have a better understanding of the potential of games as a medium, and that requires you to look further afield than just making choices in a traditional narrative structure. So, how do we do it? Well, in order to understand games, one way that you can do it, one way I strongly recommend, is to look at them historically, to look at the lineages that connect different games together. We often talk about these lineages in terms of genre, right? When I talk about lineages, you can call that a synonym for genre, but what I'm really interested in is what influenced what, which elements went from what game to what game. And these lineages span the history of video games and before. And I'm going to pick out a few examples of games that have key roles in the lineages, or in the case of one or two of them that don't, but I want to talk about anyway, to try and put this secret world of game narrative together for you. And why not start in 1990 with The Secret of Monkey Island, which is a game that you might have heard of. So, Secret of Monkey Island, I'm going to look at broadly how it fits together in terms of key events that are guaranteed to happen at a particular context in the game, and what I'm going to call for now step events, things that have to happen, but it is a little bit more ambiguous how they happen. So the game starts, you have 3 trials, right? You can do them in any order. That gives the players a sense of agency. It gives the illusion of some control of the way that the story is going to go right from the outset. You've got this freedom to do these in any order. And then you travel to Monkey Island, and there's more to do there. You enter the giant monkey head, and ultimately you stop the wedding, right? And what we have here is a traditional narrative structure, right? It's an act structure with a series of events in it, and the twist is a little bit more agency because the order of events has a little bit more wiggle room in it. Now, for my game, Discworld Noir, 9 years later, I still have a conventional narrative structure, right? The story still works on a conventional narrative structure. There's an act structure, there are events that have to happen at act boundaries, and there's certain events that have to happen before the act boundaries happen. But what I really wanted to do with this game, because I was young and stupid and didn't realise how much work it was going to be to do, was open up the narrative structure of this game more than most of the point and clicks had done beforehand, except for ones that had failed horribly like Blade Runner. But let's not go there. So the way I did it was to have elements of the story that were not part of the spine, but were linked to it in various ways. So these are the cases. It's a detective game, so it's about solving cases. But every one of those cases is a vignette in its own right. It's a little short story that the characters act out that's not directly connected to the causality of the spine until it finishes. So there are 4 king cases, cases that start at one event, but the events at the end could happen in any order. There's act-spanning cases that start at one point, but we don't really know when the case ends. It depends on how quick the player is to work out how to solve the case. And the whole of Act 3, after the player discovers they're a werewolf, spoiler if you can run the game and haven't already played it, there's one huge investigative case that the player is totally left to their own devices to work out how to solve, right? That's more or less the structure of it. And it all comes down the lineage of the adventure games and the point-and-click adventures. And so I want to single out The Hobbit as a particular game of interest to me, and all the Magnetic Scroll games, with which Pawn was the first. And The Dig and Broken Sword. I've never admitted before how much of an influence Broken Sword was on Discworld Noir, because it would have been rude, because they were one of our big rivals as a British point-and-click adventure. Shouldn't really be telling Revolution that we actually liked what they did. The thing I didn't like about Broken Sword, I loved the way the character work was done. I hated the way it was so tightly structured. I really didn't like that. I felt constrained. So I borrowed from another Magnetic Scrolls game, Guild of Thieves. Guild of Thieves has a really open structure, right? The master of the Guild of Thieves drops you off from the boat and says, go and steal enough stuff and you can join the guild. But how you solve all of the puzzles, how you do all of the thefts and heists in the game can happen in any order. It's totally left to the player, and I loved that structure. I thought that structure was absolutely fantastic. And so that's what I totally ripped off for Discworld Noir. Now, all these games all use standard narrative systems, right? Act structures, chapter structures. And most games with narrative content will tend to go down that line. But they also have, of course, their own game systems with their own narrative implications. And Monkey Island is a great example because it's got the 2 standard adventure game elements. A dialogue engine, a way of giving the player choices with how to interact with other characters, and an inventory. So they've got a whole set of items to solve brain-melting puzzles, right? When I worked on Noir, I knew we'd have to do both of these, but I wanted to be clever, always trying to be clever. And so I tried to put them together into a single element, and that's the notebook. Because it's a detective game, you go out solving mysteries. So it occurred to me that the dialogue engine and the inventory could be the same thing for this style of game. It's all the clues that you currently know about, right? And you use them to talk to people. It's the dialogue engine and it's the inventory. I thought this was terribly clever. Not a single reviewer drew attention to it. Not one. But there you go. They were much more interested in the scent inventory. After you become a werewolf, you can turn into a werewolf and see scents as colours. And then there are puzzles to solve in terms of working out who those scents belong to. And in fact, most of those puzzles don't advance the game. They just fill in your knowledge of the game world and help you solve the other puzzles, which I think works rather nicely. It's a rather nice point in the game. So these are examples of games that are more geared towards traditional narrative, but still have their own game systems that are serving those traditional narrative goals. But I want to give an example from a complete other end of the scale. It's this 1984 classic by Mike Singleton, a really great British bedroom coder who sadly died a few years ago. Can I see a show of hands if you know of and have played Lords of Midnight? Please have some hands go up. Bless you all for knowing this game. Yes. So this is a fantastic piece of work, even though it is obviously ripped off from The Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, as if The Lords of Midnight wasn't a giveaway. Once I show you how the story fits together, I will remove all doubt. So on the one hand, there's a straightforward plot, which is Morkin, let's not call him Frodo's, adventure, okay? And Morkin goes off and finds the Ice Crown and then finds a way to destroy it, or he dies. But because this isn't the only plot, Morkin can die without the game ending. So this adventure plot inside Lords of Midnight is open. It doesn't end the game if Morkin gets killed, as he so often does, because like Frodo, he's a little whinger who does nothing useful. His dad, however, Luxor, who's a big strapping man, goes off with his pals and runs around the countryside recruiting other Lords of Midnight to join the battle to fight alongside, right? So as well as a linear traditional story in Morkin's adventure, we have Luxor, let's not call him Aragorn, who is off first of all, defending Zajakith, let's not call it Helm's Deep, and then mounting all the forces to go and sack Ushgarok, let's not call it Tower of Mordor, right? That's the setup for the game. And it's all running off a systems perspective. And at the center of this game is this thing, the set of characters that you recruit. And this roster, as I like to call it, is effectively an inventory. But it's an inventory of characters, the inventory of characters that you recruit and that work for you in the game. And although it didn't really spawn any direct successes other than its own sequel, this approach of using a roster of characters does occur elsewhere. So King of Dragon Pass and Six Ages, a sequel that came out just this year, has the Clan Ring, an absolutely brilliant piece of narrative design, a set of characters that you assign to this Clan Ring to advise you on the problems facing the clan. And it works brilliantly. And it's all system-based narrative coming out of this roster system. It's a beautiful piece of design. I want to give another example of a different kind of way that video games can do interesting narrative things, and it's via that game company's 2012 Journey, which is probably more familiar than Lords of Midnight. Yeah, do you know Chen? Lovely guy. I met him at GDC, although I couldn't get his name right, and he started to be really annoyed at my inability to pronounce his real Chinese name. I shouldn't have said that. Sorry, Genova. Once again, standard, straightforward, traditional narrative act structure with events on the way, right? There's a little bit of wiggle room for how they unfold. What makes Journey narratively interesting is the fact that you can meet another player, you encounter another player, and when you do, if you pair up with them, your relationship with that other player totally occludes anything else that's going on in the game. Nothing else matters except your relationship with this other complete stranger that you are working through the game with, right? This is a very, very different way of doing things, and it's inspired, in fact, Journey was inspired by 2005's The Endless Forest by Tale of Tales, who are a client of International Hobo, so I'm very proud of that. They had another go at a player encounter system in the marvelously underrated Bientôt l'été, which is the most French video game ever made, in my view. It's about a failed relationship and about you reminiscing about that failed relationship while smoking cigarettes and drinking red wine. But it's a player encounter game. You and another player meet around the table and exchange these comments about this failed relationship. And these player encounter systems, although we had to wait in video games for decent internet connection to actually get that style, they go back much further, and we could track them back if we wanted to 1974's Dungeons & Dragons, right? Now, D&D by itself didn't really do much that was interesting by player encounter. Mostly, you and your friends are just banging around euthanizing ethnic minorities like orcs and kobolds. That's largely what the game is about. But other tabletop role-playing games, and especially the newer ones that are coming out now, focus on this encounter between players, putting players into unique situations, unique narrative situations that create memorable engagement. It's a very different way of operating. And returning to this idea of lineages, it's Dungeons & Dragons that inspires both Colossal Cave and Zork in 76, 77, 77, 79. They don't have the player encounter element, but that comes back in with another British game, 1978's Mud 1, the original MMO. It's British. If the British government had cared about video games, which they took a long, long time to do, we could have made a ton of money off pioneering what is actually one of the most successful commercial video game forms around. But no, the British government didn't care. But don't let me go up on my soapbox or we'll never get finished. What I really want to talk about here is the influence of Dungeons & Dragons on two levels, right? On the first place, it's the origin of the inventory. I can find no real inventory systems prior to Dungeons & Dragons, right? It invents it out of the need to find a way to take the kind of heroic stories that Tolkien and Michael Moorcock were creating, and these were two of the main influences that fed into Dungeons & Dragons. They needed a way to do it in game mechanics, and part of that ended up having to be a list of objects that you owned, which has become increasingly more important as games have used inventories ever since. So it's the origin of the inventory, which is a central part, as we already saw earlier, of the adventure game format. But it's also the origin of encounter play, because round the table, you didn't need the internet to talk to each other, although I gather millennials still need the internet to talk to each other when they're sat around the table. So we have these really interesting ways of doing game narrative that massively transcend traditional narrative. It doesn't mean we're not interested in the way traditional narrative works. We are. But we can do things with game stories that other media have not had the option to pursue. Now, I find it a really interesting aspect of the way everything's come together. Now, in my 30 years working in video games, I've never had an opportunity to announce a game while I've been doing a speaking gig. So it gives me great pleasure to announce this game, Silk, which is under development at the moment. And it's my attempt to do a tribute to Mike Singleton and to Lords of Midnight specifically. I've always wanted to do a tribute to Lords of Midnight. It never made any sense. It doesn't really make any sense now. I'm just going to do it anyway, right? So this is a systems adventure like Lords of Midnight set in the Silk Road of 200 AD. So you've got the Roman Empire on the western end, and you've got Three Kingdoms China on the eastern end, and all sorts of fascinating political upheaval in between. And it's a game we're working on at the moment. We hope to release next year. Fingers crossed. Of course, now I've successfully announced it, this project is cursed and will never be finished, but at least I got to announce a project. You can't take that away from me. So to sum up my little tour of the secret world of game narrative, the three themes that we touched on here. Firstly, if my clicker will work, hello clicker, my clicker has died. I have to switch to the keyboard. Aha! So, first of all, games and stories are systems that have to work together, right? One of them doesn't get priority over the other. Game systems produce stories. Stories rely on systems. They're tied together. They have to work together if you're going to do it right. And every game is part of a lineage, and every story is part of a lineage, right? When we're talking about genres, we're talking about the connectivity between different media, different artworks, right? And every game is drawing from influences both in games and in other media. And we don't like to admit it. There's this weird thing whereby it's apparently much, much better if you invented everything from whole cloth, even though obviously large parts of your game were inspired by other games. I have much more respect for people who can identify their influences and name them than the people who think they just invented it all on their own, because that's total bull. Anyway, the last theme from today's presentation. When you're working on narrative design, you need to find the right game systems and the right story systems for the game you're making, right? Don't listen to anyone who claims to have solved all the problems of game design and game narrative and that says you must do it this way or you must do it this way. Well, that probably works for some games. It doesn't work for all games. You have to know the game you want to make, the game you're trying to make. You have to have the vision, or I've been reading Kant recently, the spirit of the artwork you're trying to put together. You have to know that, and you have to find the game design elements and the game narrative elements that work for the game you are trying to make. And you can't afford to do it without forgetting that the games and the stories have to work together, and the game you're making is part of a larger story, right? It's part of the history of games. Whether you are recognized for it or not, you are contributing to the history of games every time you make a game. That's my presentation for today. I have a little bit of time for questions. Alistair will tell you exactly how much. If you're interested in the virtuous cyborg or want to suck up to me, I'll happily sell you a signed copy of the book after my talk. And if you're interested in Silk, please sign up for the newsletter at ihobo.com. We need all the help we can get. It's going to be a very low-budget game that I'm squeezing out of the side of the big corporate projects we're working on. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Chris Bateman. Thank you very much.
Chris Bateman. And we have about 2 minutes for maybe 2 questions. So who thinks they have the best question?
We will not get two questions
One
in 2
question. Half a question. Who has the best question? Who has the first question? I put too much pressure on you. Guys, you're eating into your own question answering time here.
Someone can put a hand up. I know you all have hands. Actually, I don't know you all have hands. My apologies to anyone in the room with no hands.
Oh, I can see.
Oh, there's a hand.
I can see one hand from someone who has at least one hand.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in you're talking about the 10-player motivations. Is there somewhere we can go or a book we can purchase to
Not
learn
yet.
more about
No,
that?
I only presented this material for the first time at Develop this year. If they give me an hour slot here, I would have talked to you all about it. But no, Ragnar had to get the hour slot, didn't he? So not yet is the answer to that, but there will be stuff coming down the line for it. It's just a matter of finding the time to actually put it together in a form for wider consumption. That actually was fast enough. Can we manage one more?
Does anybody else have a strange-looking gentleman at the back?
Yeah, it is. I noticed the narrative. Who owns the rights to Discworld Noir? And will it ever be sort of put on something like goodorgames.com?
Right.
Where everyone can run the damn game.
Yeah, so
Rather than spending half the lifetime trying to get a Windows XP.
who owns the rights to Discworld Noir? The answer to that question is nobody knows. Nobody knows who owns the rights to that game. Since the publisher no longer exists, the deal that Greg, my boss, made with Terry was ambiguous to say the least. My sense of this is that nobody is in a position to reissue it. However, before he died, Terry did give permission to the ScumVM project to make ports, free ports, of all the Discworld games. It's just porting Discworld Noir turns out to be a colossal bastard. And so I'm not sure they'll ever manage it. So there cannot be a paid distribution of Discworld Noir. But there can eventually be a free distribution of it. But mindful of the fact that the rights are in limbo, I just last week publicly announced my intention to try and do a spiritual successor to Discworld Noir, since that's something I can do, even if I can't re-release Discworld Noir. So thank you for the opportunity to plug yet another project. That's excellent. Thank you.
Chris Bateman.